You're with Dr. Sustainability. So on this episode, we will be discussing the journey to net zero. I have two special guests with me. We have Dr. Jenifer Baxter, who specialises in energy and also is a CEO of Industry Wales. We also have Ben Burggraaf, CEO of Net Zero Wales. Wales is one place of three in the world where we have sustainability built into our constitution. That means all aspects of our life, including policy and industry, should be formulated around sustainability long term. So without further ado, welcome to my guests. We'll get to know them a bit more. So welcome, Jen. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks, Hish.
Okay.
Thanks for having us.
The way we're framing it is that we'd like to get to know our guests. So we're going to get to know you one by one, your journey to sustainability and your work right now. And then we're going to get straight into net zero, industry, looking at Wales and the journey and the struggles that we may be facing and the opportunities that lie ahead. So Jenifer, let's start with you. Could you, for anyone that's listening in today, give us an overview of how you started off in terms of your journey to sustainability?
Well, that's quite a big question, really. If I go back in time, let's go back to, say, 1995. I was 18 years old and I'd already had my first child and hadn't gone to university. And that was a very unusual time, I suppose, for me, but it was also very grounding. He made me think quite differently about the world and what I needed to do. I'd always been an environmentalist, interested in the road protests which were happening at the time, participating in opportunities to have my say when I could. And I made the decision then that I probably needed to go to university and get an education so that I could support my son, and that's what I did. I made the decision to become an environmental engineer, and my dad took me to the Centre for Alternative Technology in Machynlleth and let me have a think about the types of opportunities that were open to me. And then I went to Cardiff University 3 times to do environmental engineering, sustainability planning and environmental policy. And then finally to my PhD in hydrogen production from waste. So it's just been a kind of gradual journey, and I've worked for the Environment Agency in Wales, as it was then, the Welsh Government. I've worked at Cabot Carbon, I've worked at what is now Celsa Steel Works, and then at the universities as a lecturer, at the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, and now as the CEO of Industry Wales. So it's been my whole adult life, but it has also provided me with a huge number of opportunities to contribute to Welsh life as well, and to national life in the UK.
Fantastic. So taking a step back in terms of your early life, you mentioned obviously being an environmentalist. What did it mean back in the day to be environmental?
Well, I think one of the interesting things is that back then you were a bit of an oddity if you were interested in the environment, which sounds really bizarre now because we all spend so much time outside. But I always felt very connected to the outdoors. I always had a real feeling that the way in which we behaved as humans, particularly around the amount that we consume and the way that we treat people around getting resources out of the ground, was not good, and that there were ways that we could do it better. So really my whole focus was on, why are we doing it this way? Why can't we produce things in a cleaner way? Why are we making our environments polluted with lots of vehicles? We still had leaded petrol back then. So there were, all of these changes that were talked about. And I think to add to that, we had not long had the Rio Earth Summit. And so for some of us who were teenagers at that time, there was more talk around the environment, and you'd see it more in magazines and papers.
So for dating that would be around 1992?
1992, yeah. Okay. I think I was 15.
Okay. And did it have an impact on you long term then? Yeah,
that's been my whole... I find the COPs really disappointing today, because back then that was it. We're going to change the world, and the Rio Earth Summit was about the whole world getting together to say, this is an unacceptable way to behave, we should be doing things better. And I thought, well, this is great, this is amazing, I can be part of this. And now we are 27 years later or whatever it is, and I think, oh, it's more than that, isn't it? That's just me thinking that the 90s is only a couple of decades ago. So 30 something years later, thinking, that we haven't made those changes that actually we promised that we would then. So it has had a lasting impact, but it's also helped me to think about the environment in a different way and to try not to treat it as something that is separate. So I don't see myself really as an environmentalist anymore, although I am. It should be the way that we do everything. So it's just how we progress and how we make sure that our future technologies are suitable for future generations.
Keeping with you in terms of where you are, so could you give us a bit of an overview of what you're currently working on? Recently taken over the role as Chief Executive Officer for Industry Wales.
Yeah, so Industry Wales, we are an arm's length public body, and we're an organisation whose role it is to be both the voice of industry in Wales and to communicate with industry in Wales. So we talk to both government and to industry, and Industry Wales is an umbrella organisation, and Net Zero Industry Wales, where Ben works, is part of that. We also have the Wales Automotive Forum, Aerospace Wales, Space Wales and Technology Connected, and they all look at different sectors that have been historically very important in Wales and that those sectors are changing. So for example, and I'll let Ben talk about this more, but Ben looks at decarbonisation of some of our larger industries. So Wales has a long history of heavy industry, and that all has to be decarbonised in one way or another to improve the environments in which it operates. We also used to have a very large automotive sector that has been diminishing in recent years, but we still have a lot of companies that operate within that area. The same goes for aerospace, and increasingly we're doing more in the space sector, so looking at satellites, we're looking at ways in which those services from satellites can actually communicate to the ground and how we can support the environment that way. And then Technology Connected looks at digital and AI and new areas around meditech, fintech, educational technologies. So there's lots of different activities that are happening. And I've only recently taken over about 2.5 months ago, and we're now sort of thinking about, well, what are the other sectors that are upcoming in Wales? So creative industries, we've got quite an increasing financial sector, we do a lot of services, a lot of tourism, and then there's obviously the farming, agriculture, food and drink sectors as well. So there's a lot happening, and really what we're here to do is to support all of those organisations who work in those sectors, but also to inform government with intelligence of emerging solutions or businesses that are interested in coming to Wales, and making sure that we can create a supply chain that creates a sustainable environment here as well.
Fantastic. So in your job, 2.5 months in now, what have you faced? What have you come across?
So I think really in the first sort of 2.5 months, the main thing has been about getting to know the organisation in more detail. So I was on the board for 3 years, as you know, because that's how we met. But I think one of the interesting elements to it is that when you transfer from being a board member to running an organisation, is that there are a lot of things happening that you perhaps weren't aware of because they're part of the everyday running. So some interesting things that are happening is the movement on small modular reactors for new nuclear in Wales. That's quite an interesting area. There's also, as I say, the issues around creative industries. We've got quite established creative industries here, and it's how do we support that, the fashion industry, for example. So there are little areas that are sort of popping up where there is an opportunity for us to provide more support and be more active. And it's just making sure that we understand what the people of Wales need and also how we provide that information effectively into government.
Oh, fantastic. So separate to your role there, obviously you also specialise in energy. Could you give us a bit of an overview how life in energy looks like or looked like?
Well, so yeah, I worked in energy and the environment for 25 years, and I think probably over the course of the last 13 years, my primary areas have been around new nuclear, around hydrogen production and renewables. And I think one of the really interesting challenges is, and I'll probably keep this quite short, is that I don't think it's very well understood just how much energy we use and how much we have to replace with decarbonised solutions. And one of the other areas that is important is to understand that there isn't just one pathway to this solution. We will continue to have emerging technologies. We have some great ideas around renewables, some interesting elements around particularly hydrogen production, the possibilities for creating alternative and synthetic fuels and chemicals. There's a lot happening in these areas, but the amount of power you need to do this, whether it be hydrogen production, electrification, whether it be carbon capture and storage, whether you're producing chemicals, electricity is needed in all of that, and that all has to be decarbonised. And that doesn't even get into how you electrify all of the heating systems. So the amount that we're talking about is much more significant, and then moving that around using the grid system, that's also difficult because our grid system is not equipped for what we're asking it to do. So we need to kind of find our way through all of that, and I think, you know, when Ben talks a bit about his work, there's a lot of that is happening in that part of the Industry Wales family.
Seems like there's a lot going on there.
There is a lot going on, yeah.
We'll move over to Ben. So from your name and from speaking to you before we started off, I'm assuming your journey to sustainability in Wales didn't start here.
I would say it's probably at its infancy from that perspective, because I've actually, unlike Jen, I've actually never had a real interest in environment and as such. I was actually much more interested about how things are being put together. I'm a real kind of, from a young age, I was really like a engineering kind of type boy. Loved Lego. I'm a Lego master builder, one of those kind of placards. I got a certificate. And what I also love doing is actually love pulling things apart and reconfiguring things or remaking stuff which was in my brain. So I was like a really long Lego mind, and that brought me then also into my A levels. We don't have A levels in the Netherlands where I grew up, but equivalent. And I was always an engineering kind of mind. I always loved physics, chemistry, those things, and struggle with languages. Doing all right now, I think. But that's the kind of thing. So I always came from this place where I really wanted to solve problems, and I wanted to make an impact. But I always loved pulling things apart and tinkering. And I still love repairing stuff. And so I think there is a real alignment there with sustainability, because I hate throwing things away.
Okay.
I'm not a person that buys clothes regularly. I wear it until the holes come in. And my mum says normally that maybe you should buy some new clothes. And I really like any piece of equipment I buy. I try to buy stuff that is decent quality, and also that will stay with me for a long time.
Sounds like you're living a sustainable life.
Yeah, but I come from a different angle. Okay. So I didn't come at primarily from an environmental perspective, but I am quite careful with those kind of things, and I want to keep things going. So I am still a bit of a petrol head. I like old cars, always had as a boy.
Okay.
But I'd like to keep things going. And that's always been, I think, one of my key kind of like hobbies and interests, and that's how I started to get into engineering, I would say. And when I went to university, the only one thing I could do, and that was mechanical engineering. So I'm a key member, like Jen, and I always loved engineering, and that brought me then in my first job at Chorus. And I rolled into what was called then a bit more combustion engineering type role. So I did a lot of field switching in steelworks, changing from natural gas in steelworks arising gases, and did a lot of work around computational fluid dynamics when that came in through, and used that tool as a design tool. And that was one of my actually graduation theses. And I designed new burners for the steel industry, and one of them actually is operational in Port Talbot. And also one in India and other places. So One of the designs I made during my graduation thesis and my master's thesis was all based on that piece of work. And I always have been in that mind frame to do that, and that's how I then ended up working in R&D within the Chorus family, which then became the Tata family at that time, and trying to solve all kinds of problems in the steelworks, and also some of the engineering around aluminium and other areas. So I come from a whole different perspective, and that's how I then ultimately rolled from combustion engineering into energy management, and then also into carbon management.
Okay, so now falling into carbon management as Chief Executive Officer for Net Zero Industry Wales, which is the forefront for implementing net zero and the targets. What do you see that lies ahead for you?
So I think what I think is very important to think about this is a transformational change for industry, for society as a whole, and net zero is an end point. It's not the journey. And I often say to people, actually, reaching net zero is like climbing Mount Everest. It's a huge task, and we often forget that we first need to go to base camp. And most people will actually say to me, Ben, what do I need to do to get to net zero? And ask me a lot of these questions. I said, I often make the analogy of climbing Everest. And I said, you would never join me tomorrow on climbing Everest, unprepared, untrained, with no gear with you. And so you have to start thinking about how actually do I get myself prepared, knowing yourself better, the organization you work in better, and get to a point where you actually can say, I'm actually prepared to go to base camp, let alone go all the way to the top, which is net zero. And the other important thing is it's something that needs to be done very quickly, where you would sometimes prepare a lifetime for climbing Everest. Actually, what we have to do, and particularly to mitigate some of those rapid rises in temperatures, we have to start taking action now, and considerable action, to actually reduce the cumulative kind of emissions, which I think is more important and is often forgotten in some of these discussions, because we're focusing so much on the long-term goal that we forget that we have to make significant changes in the next 10 years in order for us to have at least a chance of limiting global warming by a maximum of 2 degrees. Let alone at the 1.5 degrees, which I think most people now start to think that is not possible anymore. So I think when it comes to net zero, I think we first need to think about the scale of the challenge. We need to make sure that we actually get prepared for it. But also we need to get in our mind that we have to take some action now.
We've fallen into the topic of net zero. I'd like to bring you both together to now discuss what is net zero. Ben?
So if you take it from a very purist perspective, then you talk about zero emissions on scope 1, 2 and 3. So when people don't know the scopes, I think, so scope 1 is everything what comes out of the tailpipe, out of the chimney, is normally related to the fossil fuel use, but also some process emissions. So in the water industry, you have a lot of methane and nitrous oxide emissions.
So direct emissions.
So these are direct emissions, normally within the boundaries of where you work or live. Then you have scope 2, is normally associated with the generation of electricity. So there are in producing electricity, which you get through the mains, you will still have some carbon emissions associated, because you either have coal, not anymore in the UK, but you have in other parts of Europe still. You have gas, you've got nuclear, got all kinds of other kind of sources, and that puts together the electricity mix, and there's also some carbon emissions associated with that. And then scope 3 is basically everything else, and that's normally associated with the goods and services that you buy on a regular basis. So these are normally resulting in emissions somewhere else in the UK, or actually most likely somewhere else in the world. And the scope 3 emission sources, they also need to go to zero.
Yeah.
And that's the most difficult part, because one, we don't have really good information about what those emissions are, and two, do we actually see those emissions? Do we actually change the way we make buy those products?
I think it's quite complex. I work in the area of scope 3, and a lot of it's around data, who controls information, can you get your information to that? Do they capture it in the first place? They've never captured perhaps ever before, so why are you asking them now? They're a random factory in a random country now. So it is like taking people on a journey, and from my understanding, most of our emissions sit in scope 3 is the grand challenge ahead for us. So in terms of unpicking scope 3, how do you think people should be tackling that?
So I think, first of all, and this is where I think often people get a bit tangled up, I think I made the analogy earlier about Mount Everest, Mm-hmm. So often people mistake net zero for carbon neutrality. Yeah. And carbon neutrality is basically bringing your scope 1 and 2 emissions to zero. And for me, that's base camp. Yeah, so you get to base camp, and there's a lot of stuff in there about what we can control. So in every household, we will use petrol in our cars. We use sometimes EVs. We drive an EV, and then we still have some emissions associated with that. Let's start using less of that. So let's drive less miles, let's walk more, those things. You also have the kind of like the way we procure electricity, the way we actually heat our homes, using heat pumps. So there's a lot of stuff we could do in the scope 1, 2 arena. Although it's not cheap, but it is something we can start to control or influence. A lot of the scope 3 emissions is outside of sphere of influence, and we need to start getting ourselves better educated about where things come from. How do we consume less? How do we consume more locally? How do we make sure that actually things last longer and can be repaired? Those kind of things. And that is for me actually the real challenge, and that is from base camp all the way to Everest, because it involves actually dealing with entities and with organizations and countries which don't have the same values, the same standards which we have in. So we have to really start to think about how do we bring those emissions to zero. And when I see public sector organizations saying openly that we're going to reach net zero by 2030, of which the majority of their emissions are scope 3, then you have to ask yourself the question, as I'm a very pragmatic person, is that achievable to bring that to zero? And most people actually mean to say that they want to bring it down to carbon neutrality, which is scope 1 or 2 emissions.
Could it be that there's a communication issue there, or maybe it's a fact there's so much pressure to deliver that people are committing and pledging, not assuming that they're going to be held accountable for these pledges and targets?
Well, it's such a massive thing to do, isn't it? I mean, we're talking about almost complete transformation of the way that we provide goods and services across the world. So it's not even just here in the UK, in Wales, it's everywhere. And we've gone from an industrial revolution which focused very much on the use of coal, and coal is still used globally by many countries as its primary source of electricity, and it's hugely polluting. So I think the task of what we're asking, and that's just one element, once you get into these areas around mining, how we get the resources, how, if you understand how an EV is built and the amount of emissions that are embedded in a vehicle, you have to drive quite a long way to get to that neutral state that Ben's talking about.
So someone new to climate change, what would embedded carbon mean?
So it's the amount of emissions that are produced during the production phase. So if you are manufacturing a vehicle, you will have, if you like, upstream activities, which could be the mining activities, the transportation costs of moving those materials to a factory that then produces the steel parts, the plastic parts, the battery parts, all of the electronic parts of the car, and then it's all put together, and that requires energy, and then that's produced as your final product, and you drive it around for between, I think it's around 60 to 100,000 miles in some vehicles to get it back. It depends on the vehicle, to get yourself to a neutral position. All of that process, though, as well, requires you to put electricity into the vehicle, and depending on where your electricity comes from for that, you will continue to add emissions to your electric vehicles, kind of embedded emissions, if you like. So just understanding processes around product manufacture and use is probably one of the biggest challenges, and that plays into the scope 3 issue. The work where Ben, I think, is particularly interested around scope 1 and 2, particularly in direct emissions from industry, that almost feels to me like the easier part of the problem. That is easier to solve and almost easier to understand, because you can say, here is a factory, it has a chimney, it produces these emissions out of the chimney. Let's change the technology within it to stop that happening. And that feels like the easy part of the problem. I think the wider part of the problem is the more of the sustainability agenda, which is how we actually behave as a society. So how much we consume, how much we travel, how much we want to eat, for example.
Could this inherently be a fight against capitalism?
Well, it's always a very tricky one. So capitalism is our kind of framework that we exist within. So to say that we want to be anti-capitalist wouldn't really actually benefit anyone, because when you look at how everything is connected, you will understand that the goods and services that are provided to us through our taxation and through government, whether it's our healthcare system, whether it's the medicines that are produced within that, whether it is perhaps the care sector that looks after our elderly parents and children, to have the money in order to provide the services and the infrastructure that we require, you've got to produce money, which is from stuff. So it's a really challenging system. So when I think about sustainability, I think very much about, probably less about net zero and more about pollution. So we want cleaner soils, cleaner air, cleaner water. There are kind of ecosystem services that provide us with everything that we need every day. They're not, we kind of stretch that out to doing, food production better, doing mining better, doing manufacturing better. And so I kind of see the whole system together and try and think about not just energy, but how much more widely we are reducing our polluting activities. So I think it's a really big challenge, and I think that that's often why it's easier to sort of not engage with it, because when you start to really understand the detail of it, it can become overwhelming. And you know, there's times I felt like this is too much. I can't. There's nothing I can do. But you have to kind of keep having, you know, be positively hopeful.
This is more so to Ben. So to give context, I was sitting at home minding my own business, and I went on my phone and I came across a video of Ben, and he seemed very smug on the video, and he was explaining the Dutch oven. Can you explain that to anyone listening here? Because I thought that was a very good analogy.
Yeah, and other people said it wasn't.
Okay. You enjoyed it. That's the main thing.
Now, the reason why I was doing it, because there is this was all in relationship to the committee hearing that looked at the charter transition. And what I often hear is that a blast furnace will be replaced by an electric arc furnace. And that were the questions were actually asked by the politicians in the room. Also
looked quite serious.
And they were all talking me that thing. And I think it's incredibly important to explain to people properly that you cannot actually replace a blast furnace with an electric arc furnace. So there are two different routes of making steel. One is using a blast furnace route. You take iron ore, you take coal, you reduce the iron ore, you create pig iron, and then still high carbon. You bring that into what we call a basic oxygen steel furnace or oxygen steel making process. And then you use oxygen to get all of the carbon out, and you bring it then from a iron product into a steel. So steel, the difference between steel and iron is the carbon content in there. So high carbon is iron, low carbon is steel that makes it ductile and malleable, all those things. So that's the difference between steel and iron. Now, what an electric arc furnace does is actually replace the basic oxygen steel making process. Okay. So that is the refining process that makes it from iron into steel. But what you can also do in an electric arc furnace is actually bring much high levels of scrap material in, which is already steel, but recycled and normally has some contaminants in there. It could be copper, it could be zinc, it could be all that kind of stuff. And you then refine it into a way that actually makes it into a high-grade steel product again. So you replace an electric arc, a basic oxygen steel maker plant with an electric arc furnace, and the blast furnace is going to be removed altogether. And the alternative to that is what is called a high HBI, hot briquetting iron, or a direct reduction iron that is reducing the iron ore using natural gas or some other kind of sources. And that's the kind of natural transition. Now, then the conversation led on, can you actually make the same grade of steel in an electric arc furnace?
This is the part, everyone.
And this is why I came with the analogy of the Dutch oven, because you can use a Dutch oven as a frying pan. So you can put your oil in it, and you can put all of the kind of like fast food in what you like. Okay. In the Netherlands we like our snacks, so the croquettes, the frikandels, the chips. Yeah. Okay. And that is not necessarily something that we are actually good quality food, is it? It's fast food. But in a Dutch oven you can also make very healthy, nutritious meals. And if you're a Michelin chef, you can make fantastic good kind of thing. So it's about the quality of the ingredients you put in there, as well as the skill level of the person that's operating the kit. So that's why I made the analogy, because an electric arc furnace is your Dutch oven. Depending on your skill level of your operators, depending on the quality of the raw materials, you can create the kind of type of products. It could be ranging from Michelin star food all the way up to fast food. Yeah. So that's where the analogy came from. And because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what the blast furnace does and what electric arc furnace does. And I think it's important to explain to people the differences. And in principle, you can actually make the same output.
You get into the big challenge for us will be our recycling supply chains.
Correct.
And that's where, so Ben's absolutely right. It's all about what you put in.
Yes.
But we aren't set up to sort our steel in the way that it would be required. Yeah. So there will be a huge amount of supply chain work that will have to be done in order to provide the steelworks with the steel that it needs to put it into the arc furnace.
And there's also skill and technology level on that. So I did a lot of work, which I was actually part of a world steel benchmarking group where we actually benchmark steelworks across the world. And what I found in electric arc in particular is that you can actually use a much lower quality grade steel, scrap steel, but if you have the skills and technology, and particularly now with AI and machine learning and digital twins, there's a huge capability emerging about actually controlling that quality much better, because you can almost simulate what actually happens in those very large vessels almost real time, and you can do quite a lot with that. So that technology and skill level on top of the scrap quality, those combined, actually can make a huge difference to that piece. And that's what Tata is saying, but also Swansea University and others saying, is that actually through innovation we can actually probably deal with lower quality scrap while still maintaining the same product quality.
I liked your analogy, but why does it have to be the Dutch oven? Could it not be the Welsh oven?
Because the Dutch oven is a thing, isn't it?
It's a thing. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I didn't know that.
Okay.
So I never heard of a Dutch oven
Okay.
before I started living in the UK.
Oh, okay.
And it's a basic cast iron pan.
Okay.
I recently researched, but I can't remember exactly where it came from. But it is all to do with the cast iron pan.
Okay.
Are you going to tell me it's not Dutch now as well?
Correct. It has nothing to do with it. So.
Okay, well, just to close the session, what I'm doing with all my guests is we're passing over a question. So, from our previous guest, that's Dr. Ade. He's a specialist in, it's long-winded, sustainable supply chain management and operation management. He has an interest in fairness, equality, and what's currently happening in, as he refers, Northern Europe, and expectations of Northern Europe across other parts of the world. So some of his concerns is around equality, fairness, and the fact that there's countries going forward signing up to treaties, maybe not materialising it later on, and also understand the demographics and how society sits. We have a mixed bag of people in this country. Some people on the ride, some people don't know what's going on. We have same with industry as well. So I think that's where his question sat. It was, how do we take the whole of society with us with this movement?
Okay, well, so that's a massive
It's a massive question. He really wanted that question.
So why don't we let's frame it around Wales, just because it's easier. So I still consider us a Northern Europe territory, but so when we were talking earlier, we talked a bit about how are different industries relating to the net zero challenge or to the transition. So industry is a really nebulous concept. It just means different sector groups of businesses. So if we take it down a step and we say, what is the relationship between net zero and your regular everyday business, which are mostly in Wales, something huge like 90% are SMEs and micro businesses.
Yeah, pretty much.
So that group, there will be some companies who are very much focused on their environmental agenda. There will be others who cannot think about it because the resource management or their requirements to run their business on a day-to-day is really difficult.
Yeah.
So when we talk about taking the whole of society with us, we're talking about people who can engage and can't engage. So there's a lot of work that is done at a much higher level on changing products, for example. Back in the days when we were in the EU, we had to reduce the suction on vacuum cleaners because it used too much power. And there are a number of other things where efficiencies were brought in. So you have to do it in multiple different ways. There's communication, there's technological advancement, and there is kind of just sort of evolution as well. And there's also allowing people the opportunity and the space to participate, which we don't always. A lot of committees and groups who perhaps deal with everything from the council committees right down to school governors have much more challenging day-to-day problems than they would consider the energy system or the environment to be part of. Can they educate the children? Can they provide there was a news article recently where the headmaster of a local school was also the caretaker.
What?
Do they have enough money to actually provide the services they need? So I think what we can do from our position is to say that we keep supporting governments in order to write the correct policies or that support people, and that we continue to communicate with all different groups and organisations, and making sure that people have a say in what happens and feel engaged. But everyone's not going to be engaged. It's a bit like marketing, isn't it? Everything's not for everyone. Some people will find other parts of their lives much more interesting. But there will come a time for future generations where things like new builds for infrastructure, for adapting to changing water environments, to adapting for changing heat environments, will actually sort of come in. So people will find that they'll have to make those changes anyway. So whatever people think, they're all on this journey as well. So it's very difficult. I don't think you can take everyone with you, but you can support everyone on the way.
I think there's another element to this. So I think I want to bring it to slightly, because you talked earlier at the podcast to talk about anxiety, climate anxiety. I think a lot of it's been driven by the fact that a lot of people feel that net zero is done to them and that they have very little influence or control over what they can do in order to prevent that. So for me, it's really, if we want to bring people along, we have to start empowering them. And that's really important to not only individuals but businesses, so they don't feel that net zero is done to them. And I think that's where we are at the moment, that people talk about these long-term targets that actually drives policies which certain sticks and puts caps on things. So for example, in house building or whatever that is maybe, and actually stops people from doing something. Without giving them, okay, these are the things you could do in order then to still make it happen, but in a different way. And I think that's the kind of thing, is that trade-off, that empowering people to actually make informed decisions. And I think for me that starts off with those kind of things, and make people a bit more aware about where things come from, have conversations about that. And I think those public discussions take place too little. And a good example of that is if I go to the Netherlands, once I look at a primetime comedian at 8 o'clock, he spent in half an hour, and he comes from a left progressive kind of end, explaining why fossil fuels still are an integral part of our economy now, and it will be impossible to stop doing that tomorrow. And he spent a half an hour with millions of people watching that talk about this topic alone in a satire show, because he felt it was necessary to have a conversation about this. And I think this is what needs to happen, in wider society, in the media and other places. We need to start having proper conversations about this, so people can actually talk about it when they have a birthday party about whether they have a heat pump or not. And those conversations are not taking place in this country enough. And I do see that they're happening in nations like Sweden, the Netherlands, Denmark, Germany.
Could that be why
places.
they're more progressive than us?
I think so, and it's because I think they have a much better public ethical debate about these things, what the trade-offs are, what the choices they need to make, what are the sticks, but also what are the carrots, in order to bring them to a point that they make some informed decisions themselves. So they feel empowered to make that decision. And I think that is something that I think needs to happen, and that's what we need to learn from other nations. And I think the media plays a big role in that, and I'm truly quite disappointed in the mainstream media as to how they cover some of the net zero agenda. It's either about the kind of like, it's the doom and gloom, we're going to physically lose all of our habitats and everything else, and we're not doing anything about it. Or if we do something about it, they're only advertising on the negatives rather than also on the positives. And I think that is something we need to stop. We need to have a really much better informed debate about that.
They polarise everything.
Yes.
There's no need to polarise it. But then their business is making news. So that's their only way of doing it. But I think actually that culturally, when I was doing my masters, we went to the Netherlands a few times to study their, I think it was called the National Environmental Planning Policy that they have there. And culturally, the engagement with communities where new housing estates or new factories are going to be built, or whether they're doing flood defences, is so well established. We don't really have an equivalent here.
Maybe we need that, because there's a lot of things going to be happening.
I think we do, but I think Dutch people may be more inclined to engage because it's
it's a cultural thing. It's when I come back, it's about the actual physical kind of like culture of polderen, getting the compromise. And also there are some institutions that's organized. So for example, the waterschap, so the kind of like the local area that looks after all of the water resources, are one of the oldest democracies of the world. So there are some institutional and cultural things that actually go hand in hand. So you can't do one without the other. So you have to you need to organize yourself properly for that. And those two things, one doesn't come without the other. So
Okay, a lot of food for thought. So now to hand over to the next part is, I asked you if you'd like to ask a question for the next guest. You could write it here, or you could give them a question after. It could be one question each or one together. It's up to you.
Well, I think I'll have to think about it. And it would be, interesting to know what your kind of next subject area might be on.
Okay.
And then I can kind of frame the question around that.
Okay, that sounds good to me. What about yourself, Ben?
I think for me, on the basis of the discussion we had, I think the other gas is make them think about what would they do differently tomorrow to live a little bit more sustainable or less carbon intensive life. What is the single step they would agree to do with their family or with their friends or anything else differently tomorrow to actually make them start their journey to net zero or a more sustainable journey?
Thank you. I think that's a nice way to end it. So I think that's us closing the episode. Thank you, Jen and Ben, the double act. Thank you for being patient with me as well. Thank you for everyone listening into this episode.